Well, welcome all you wiretappers out there. Back here in the studio, Gangland Wire. I have my friend and regular contributor almost, Jeffrey Sussman. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, Gary.
All right, we've done several shows together about boxing and the mob and about boxing in general. What else have we done? We've done several other shows. We did that. What we're going to talk about today, folks, is he's got a book coming out in paperback just about the time this is released. Big Apple Gangsters, the rise and decline of the mob in New York. And when we talked about this book before in hardback, we talked about Scarpa, Gregory Scarpa. And so there's a lot of different stories in there. And what other books do you have? Oh, we've got one coming up that he quotes me in, guys. Let me take a look at that title. Sin City Gangsters, right?
Yes, the rise and decline of the mob in Las Vegas.
Cool. That's good. Of course, you guys know I know a little bit about the mob in Las Vegas and be quoted in that. We'll do a show on that when it comes out, right, Jeffrey?
Yeah, and not only were you quoted in it, but your book, Leaving Las Vegas, was a great resource for me.
Oh, well, good. Well, good. Today, we're going to talk about is a kind of a celebration of the release of the paperback version of Big Apple Gangsters. We're going to talk about the mob cops in New York City. I've never done a story on the mob cops. And I always thought it was interesting. These two guys, it's like they were mobsters that got jobs as policemen and then worked their way. One worked his way into the intelligence unit, I believe, and the other one was some kind of a homicide detective. It's Louis Eppolito and Steve Caracopa. Did I get those pronounced right?
Caracappa.
Caracappa. And which one was in the intelligence unit? One of them was in their intelligence unit.
Louis Eppolito.
Okay. And then what did Steve do? He was a homicide detective?
Yeah, he was in cold cases and homicide.
So, and both of them gave him access to a lot of information. You know, Gotti had this Bill Peist, who was actually a civilian clerk, not a civilian, a law enforcement, but he was a clerk in the intelligence unit for a period of time. And that gave him access to locations of wiretaps and bugs and information and who might be an informant and where investigations were going. So the mob was always looking for their own informants inside of law enforcement.
Exactly. And what was interesting about Eppolito and Caracappa was that Eppolito came from a mob family. His father and his uncle were mobsters, one I think was in the Lucchese family and one was in the Gambino family, and yet that didn't raise any red flags when he entered the police academy. And then Caracappa, when he was 18 years old, had with a gang had robbed a warehouse. And was caught, and he pleaded no contest, and so that kind of in a way whitewashed his record. And then he went into the army. Got out of the army, he entered the police academy, and no one really looked at these guys' records before or where they came from or their backgrounds. And I asked someone Tony Solano, who I believe you interviewed,
right,
who was a New York City detective. And I asked him why this happened. And he said, at the time, there were a lot of anti-war demonstrators going on in the city. The city was really a mess. A lot of people who would have become cops had become soldiers. They were over in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And the police department was eager to get as many recruits as they possibly could. And so they kind of overlooked a lot of things that would have been red flags in different times.
Interesting. The same thing happened probably all over the United States. Out of the riots of 1968, there was a big push to hire more cops, and they have better training and a little higher standards. And everybody was in Vietnam, 68 to 71, 72. Right. And I know my academy class, I didn't go to Nam, but about everybody else in my academy class came out of Nam and went right into the police department.
Right, exactly. Eppolito was sort of a brash kind of guy, before he turned to fat. he was a weightlifter,
Mm.
and he actually won the Mr. New York weightlifting contest.
Really?
Yeah. And but when he was off duty, he would dress like a mobster. He almost like a character out of Guys and Dolls. He wore a black shirt with a wide white tie, and he had all the big rings on his hands. And if he wasn't wearing a tie, he had a lot of gold chains around his neck.
Oh my God!
And so he looked like him, and he prided himself on being a mobster. What was interesting is there was a guy named Bert Kaplan who was a mob associate who was in prison for a white collar crime at a prison called Allenwood, which was a low security white collar prison. And he met a guy named Frank Santora, who was a cousin of Ippolito. Mm. And Kaplan said there was a guy that he had done a deal with where they had stolen treasury bonds, $500,000 worth of treasury bonds. Mm-hmm. And they were in the process of selling them. And his partner, a guy named Israel Greenwald, he felt was cheating him. And Santora said, I have a cousin who's a policeman who could take care of this guy for you if you want.
Oh boy.
And so Kaplan said, fine, let me know how much it'll cost. And he and Caracappa met as policemen. They were initially in the same precinct. And they went out and they stopped this guy Greenwald while he was driving. They were in an unmarked police car. They put the flashing red light on the roof and blasted their siren. They pulled this guy over, and he said, "Why are you stopping me?" And he said, "We need you for a lineup." And the guy reluctantly went with them.
Yeah.
And they drove him to a garage in Brooklyn, where they had him kneel down, and they shot him in the head twice.
Wow.
And then they had the owner of the garage dig a hole and bury him in the garage basement. And then they poured lye over his body and then covered it with dirt. And I think Kaplan paid them $75,000 to do this. And Kaplan was associated with Anthony Gaspipe Casso. He did favors for him and was sort of like a gopher in some ways for him. And he told Casso about this, and Casso said, "That's great. I'd like to use these guys
really
myself." And he wanted to meet them, and Kaplan said, "No, you have to deal. If you want to deal with them, you have to deal with them through me," because he didn't want to give up control of these two guys. And during this period, Ippolito, who was in intelligence, found documents that were wanted by a Gambino, who was a different Gambino. It was a crime boss in New Jersey, and he provided all of the documents, police investigatory documents that this guy wanted about him. And when the police raided Gambino's house, they went into his attic and they found all of these documents, and they traced them back to Ippolito. So there was going to be a departmental trial of Ippolito. However, when it went before a judge, the judge threw it out because he said, the fingerprints that you say are Ippolito's are Xeroxed fingerprints, and we can't be certain that they're really his. So the case was thrown out, and nothing happened to Ippolito. He just continued on.
Wow.
And even got a promotion 6 months later.
Wow.
So I mean, the police department was extremely lax in dealing with this guy. And there was a war going on with Casso and others, and Casso, there was an attempted assassination of Casso. He was in his car, and another car drove up, and as he was getting out of his car, gunmen in the other car, they fired several rounds of bullets at him. He ran into a Chinese restaurant and out the back door and managed to escape. But he wanted to get the guys who had tried to shoot him. And one of the guys was this fellow, Jimmy Heidel. He was tracked down by Ippolito and Caracappa, and they told him who Heidel was and where to find him and so forth.
Mhm.
And Heidel knew now that there was a contract out on him because of the failed killing of Casso. And he was walking in a park in a section of Brooklyn called Dykers Heights, and he saw Ippolito and Caracappa driving over to him. So he felt relieved. He thought, here are these two cops. They're going to protect me. I don't have anything to worry about. So they told him to get into the car, and they drove him to a warehouse. When they got to the warehouse, they took Heidel out of the car and they threw him in the trunk, and they drove to another location. And at that other location, it was someone's abandoned home, I think it was. They tied up Heidel in the basement. Casso started interrogating him and torturing him. So he shot him in first his left knee, then his right knee, then his elbow, then his right elbow. He shot him in the groin. Finally, Heidel gave up all the information that Casso wanted, and Heidel knew they were going to kill him. So he said to Casso, I know you're going to kill me, but could you please leave my body out in the street so that the police can identify me and my mother can collect my life insurance? Casso said, sure. Casso didn't do that. And Heidel's body was never found again. They had no idea what happened to his body.
What a jerk.
It was just terrible. And what was interesting, though, prior to their getting Jimmy Heidel, they were scouting Heidel's house. Heidel and his brother lived with their mother. His brother, Frankie Heidel, came out of the house one day, and Ippolito and Caracappa grabbed him, and then they realized it was the wrong Heidel.
Yeah.
And Frankie went back into the house and told his mother what happened. His mother was furious. She got in a car and she's driving around the neighborhood looking for these two guys who grabbed her son. She sees them a couple of blocks away, parked at a corner. She pulls up beside them and she says, what is it you want with my son? And Ippolito flashes his badge at her and says, it's police business.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't care what it is. I want to know what you were doing with my son. And he said, it's none of your business. Go home, leave us alone. And
typical police response to a citizen that sticks their nose in, I'll tell you right now. But
right. So a year or two later, she's watching television in the afternoon. She's watching an interview show called the Sally Jesse Raphael Show.
Oh, I remember that.
And on the show is Louis Ippolito, who's promoting his book called Mafia Cop. And she recognizes him. And she calls a detective whom I interviewed named Tommy Dades.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. He was at a lot of places, yeah.
Right. And Tommy Dades goes and interviews her, and he realizes they had been hearing stories about the Mafia Cops, but they could never get any information. So he goes and he interviews her, and he gets the information, and he turns it over to a prosecutor named Michael Vecchione, who was the head rackets prosecutor for the DA's office in Brooklyn. And they're compiling all this evidence against them. And then Casso, one of the killers was one of the people who tried to assassinate Casso was a guy named Nicky Guido. He wants the cops to kill Nicky Guido, but he can't find out where he lives or anything about him. So he asks the cops to do it. And they say, well, we want an additional $4,000 if you want us to do this. And Casso refuses to pay them. He says, never mind, I'll find out myself. So he has a friend who works at the Brooklyn Union Gas Company. And the guy comes up with a name and address and a location of a Nicky Guido who lives in a section of Brooklyn that's known as mob territory. And he's the same age as the Nicky Guido they're looking for. So Casso gets a couple of his gunmen to go and kill this, not the Mafia Cops, but two gunmen to go and kill this Nicky Guido. And of course, it's the wrong Nicky Guido. And they pull up alongside him. He just bought a new Nissan Maxima, and he's showing it to his uncle. And from the side windows of this car that pulled up next to him, there are several blasts of gunfire. And he throws himself over his uncle's body to protect him, but he's killed in the process. And the car of killers drive away. And Ippolito and Caracappa are furious because they said they told Kaplan that if Casso had been willing to pay us the other $4,000, we would have gotten the right person. Now he's killed an innocent person, and this further alerts the police that something bad is going on, and they have to solve the problem. And the Kaplan had been on the run for a while because he had been selling methamphetamine drugs, and he knew the cops were looking for him. So he ran away to Mexico, and Casso, there was an indictment against Casso, and Casso was hiding out at a house in New Jersey at the time, and Kaplan was in Mexico exporting marijuana back to the United States and making a lot of money. And after a while, he feels that it's safe to come back, and he comes back, and he's immediately arrested by the Brooklyn DA's squad. And he really believed in omerta. He wasn't a made man, but he was more of a mafia type than the mafia guys were. And he refuses to tell them anything. And they say, look, you're 65 years old. You're going to get at least 20 years in prison. You're not going to come out alive. But if you cooperate with us, we can make a deal with you. Mm-hmm. And he still refuses to do it. And finally, one of the investigators says to him, I can understand why you don't want to give up Eppolito and Caracappa, because the people they killed, you may think they deserved killing, but an innocent kid was killed. How do you feel about that? And apparently that pricked Kaplan's conscience. Mm-hmm. So he told them everything, everything they wanted to know.
Huh. And he's the one that actually gave up the mob cops in the end.
He gave them up. Huh. And of course he gave up Casso.
Yeah.
And he served a brief time in prison and was released on probation. And Caracappa and Eppolito were sentenced to prison, life in prison, Eppolito plus 100 years, Caracappa plus 80 years. And they both died in prison. And what was interesting about Bert Kaplan is his daughter, Deborah Kaplan, is the Chief Supreme Court Justice of the state of New York.
I'll be darned. That is a interesting turn of events.
I know. And Casso made a deal with the government to go into the witness protection program. But he was lying about so many things and refused to tell the truth about so many things that they rescinded the deal.
Yeah.
And he wound up dying in prison also.
Yeah, I remember that on Casso. I did a story on Casso. Anthony Gaspipe Casso was a pretty successful mobster. I think he had a big stolen car racket going on or something. And,
that's right, he did.
And was he working for Gambino's? Was that where Castellano was getting his stolen auto money?
No, I think he was working for the Lucchese's.
Lucchese's, okay, I couldn't remember. But he was a pretty successful mobster in his own right, business.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was. What was interesting, when I interviewed Tommy Dades and Michael Vecchione, they said something that was very interesting that I had never thought of before. He said, there are some guys in the mob who are just soldiers. Mm-hmm. And they may have made millions and millions on their own. They may be wealthier than some of the capos and some of the underbosses, but they've always remained soldiers. But they could be much wealthier than those higher ranked mafia officials.
Yeah, and I think he was one of those. He didn't seem to want the responsibility of the rank, but he was he was an earner, as they call him.
Yeah, exactly.
So those two mob cops, it just blows me away that especially one got into the intelligence unit. Of course, I understand New York's different than Kansas City. Our intelligence unit, which I was a part of, was really small, and there could be no smell of corruption about you before you were even looked at. I mean, they would vet you pretty good.
I know, it's amazing. It's amazing that Eppolito wound up in that position. And before they were indicted and tried, they both retired from the New York City Police, and they moved to a gated community in Las Vegas. Uh-huh. And Ippolito wanted to become a movie actor and a screenwriter. And actually, he had 3 bit parts in movies. And I don't know if you remember the scene in Goodfellas where Henry Hill is introducing by name a number of people sitting along a bar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I kind of remember that. Yeah,
and one of them was Ippolito.
Oh, really?
and he's presented as a member of the gang.
Huh.
And Tommy and me, and there was Anthony Stabile.
How you doing?
Frankie Carbone. And then there was Mo Black's brother, Fat Andy. And his guys, Frankie the Wop, Freddie No Nose.
Which I thought was ironic.
Yeah.
Here's a mafia cop, and he's presenting himself in a movie about real life, supposedly as a mobster.
Yeah.
And then when he wrote the book Mafia Cop, he had a photograph in there of himself and Steve Caracappa, and the caption was something like, "Here are the real mafia cops." And Caracappa was furious. He said, "Why did you do this?" He said, "This is going to tip off investigators. They're going to come looking for us." And Ippolito was just so brazen. He thought he was above it, and no one could touch him.
Yeah. I would like to see the look on his face when they popped him out there in his gated community in Las Vegas. He thought he had it made. He thought he had skinned by all of them. He was smarter than everybody. I love it when those guys.
He really did.
Smarter than everybody. Get it in the end.
Yeah, I mean, his level of arrogance was just incredible. And then at court, a guy, I can't remember his first name. His last name was Gibbs. As Ippolito was being sentenced, this guy was in the gallery in the courtroom, and he stands up and he shouts at Ippolito. He says, "Do you remember me? Do you remember me? Do you remember me?" And Ippolito looks up at him and he says, "No, I don't know who you are." And he said, "You got someone to lie and say that I knifed a prostitute and killed her so that you could get a conviction because you couldn't find the real killer. And you framed me, you bastard." And Ippolito said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I never saw you." This guy served 19 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit.
Yeah.
And New York City wound up having to pay him $19 million, $1 million for each year that he served for a crime he didn't commit. And Ippolito framed him. And apparently he framed a lot of people when he couldn't get a conviction. He would frame someone and cause somebody else to lie, usually a minor criminal, who he would threaten with arrest and conviction if he didn't go along with what Ippolito told him to say.
Interesting. Yeah, I imagine that the DA's attorney in Manhattan and Brooklyn or wherever he, had cases, I bet they had to go back and pull every one of those cases and take a look at them.
Sure. Yeah, they were all in Brooklyn, I think.
Brooklyn. Wow.
Yeah, he was amazing what he got away with, and Tony Solano briefly worked with Caracappa in the same precinct. And he said Caracappa was always very professional. He always came to work very well dressed. He always wore a jacket and a tie. He spoke very, very well. He said, and every once in a while, he would kind of slip into a kind of Brooklynese New York accent, which he had tried to overcome. That would happen when he got excited about something. But he said he would remain very, very cool and kind of detached from everyone. He didn't mingle with the other cops in the precinct and stayed aloof from them most of the time. After he moved to Las Vegas, Tony got a phone call from him, and Caracappa said to him, Tony had left the police department and opened a private detective service in Manhattan. He got a call out of the blue from Caracappa one day while Caracappa was in Las Vegas, and Caracappa said, "Look, if you ever need any information about anyone, I can get it for you. Just let me know what you want, and the price is not too high."
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, when you leave the police department, you start doing those kinds of things, then you lose all those resources. If you're honest and you do things right, you lose all those resources. I know when I started practicing law, I was tempted, trying to find somebody to serve them with papers, a summons, even just a divorce, but you don't have an address immediately. And so it's kind of tempting to call back and try to find a buddy who will use a police computer for you. And by that point in time, it used to be that wasn't that stringent, but boy, in the last few years, it got really stringent on that. So what he was doing, he just had contacts with the police computer and he could use that. Interesting.
And Tony said, it didn't register at the time exactly what Caracappa was offering him. He didn't realize, who these guys were and what they had. Though he did think it was a little odd that he got this call out of the blue or offering these services.
Yeah, I guess they probably just were, following along with people they used to work with and see what they were doing. And, he figured he could make a little extra money.
Exactly.
Doing that kind of a thing. And Tony Solano, folks, if you remember, go back and look at my interview of him. He was in the New York City Intelligence Unit, and he was assigned one time to go out and sit on John Gotti. And he has a really great Gotti story. I'll let you go back and just search on my website or on the one of your apps for the Solano, Celano. And Tony has a couple of books out there too. I can't remember the names of them now, but
they deal with they're all based on a character called Sergeant Markey.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And I think the first one was called Two in the Trunk or something like that. And he's done 3 books. He's enjoying himself as a mystery writer right now.
Well, good. I love it. When I was asked the other day in another podcast by a police chaplain about retirement, and they asked me, well, what do you think about retirement? What should people try to do? And I said, it gives you a huge amount of freedom. Do what you want to do. It's something you always wanted to do. You've got the freedom to do that now. Just at least give it a shot. You never know.
Exactly. And so, I mean, that was very good advice. I know other people who have retired and they're kind of sitting on their hands. They don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah. It's either that or they go take jobs as like a security guard in a court.
Right.
We had a lot of them that down at the federal court, they hired a whole bunch of ex-coppers that I used to work with, retired coppers. And, they just go in and stand around for 8 hours and at the magnetometers and, where they check the parcels and everything in the federal court down there. And it was a decent paying job, but, I say
it's tedious, though.
Tedious, really. Maybe some people like that. I mean, you got freedom, go try to use that freedom. That's what Tony has done that. Well, this has been about the Mafia Cops in New York City, and it's from the book, Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York by Jeffrey Sussman.
May I hold up the cover?
Oh, yeah. And on the YouTube, I'll put up, I've got a picture of that. So, they're Big Apple Gangsters. And he talks about, give us an overview of the broad spectrum that you cover in New York.
Well, it starts with Arnold Rothstein, who was really the founder of organized crime, who mentored Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis, when they were all young mobsters. Mm-hmm. And he taught them how to organize crime. He also taught them, because, these were uneducated children of immigrants.
Right.
And he taught them proper manners. He taught them how to dress, to look like successful businessmen. And he financed a lot of their operations. So when they went into bootlegging, he financed a lot of their operations. He financed a trucking company that would deliver booze. He financed some boats that would bring booze in. And when he was assassinated in 1928 at a card game at the Park Sheraton Hotel, Lansky, Siegel, Luciano, and Costello took over his operations. And then in 1931, these guys eliminated the 2 big mafia bosses at the time, Maranzano and Joe the Boss Masseria, and they formed basically the families, the 5 mafia families. But then they also formed something that was even more powerful than the 5 mafia families, and that was the National Crime Syndicate. Right. And they formed a commission, and on that commission, it was very multi-ethnic. I mean, there were Italians, there were Jews, there were Irish people. There was 1 or 2 people from whose background was Swedish. so and they really controlled and organized all organized crime throughout the United States, and they picked people from all over the country who sat on the commission, and their word was final, and there were some of the heads of the mafia families sat on that commission as well, and they had a vote on that commission, but the syndicate was larger than that. So then the book has chapters about Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Carlo Gambino, Albert Anastasia, Paul Castellano, John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, Crazy Joey Gallo, the Black Gangsters, Bumpy Johnson, Leroy Nicky Barnes, Frank Lucas, and of course the Mafia Cops. So I tried to cover the whole spectrum, beginning with Arnold Rothstein prior to World War I, going right up throughout to the end of the century, dealing with the Mafia Cops. And whereas the people at the beginning were really, in their own way, very, very brilliant and managed to control enormous number of enterprises simultaneously, the ones at the end were dummies by comparison.
Yeah.
They were just hoods who made who took advantage of scams, and they had small scores here, and they were involved in prostitution and drug selling, but nothing really big time, and which was the big difference between the early founders of organized crime and the ones who inherited it 3 generations later.
Really, I was just trying to explain to a guy the other day, and the best I could, it's kind of the evolution of the mafia back in the 20s, 30s, the organized crime, national crime syndicate. And I think a lot of this is because of prohibition and then the depression, that the mob, the organized crime members were much more part of society and politics, and not such real outcasts from society as they became later in life. As you say, they were part of society in the 30s.
Exactly.
And the 40s.
Right. Frank Costello was a delegate to the Democratic Presidential Convention that nominated Franklin Roosevelt for president.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, you couldn't imagine a Casso in that position.
Right. Nick Sabella, our boss in Kansas City, and this is after the war, but he met the local leader of the Teamsters Union, who became his confidant and really his puppet over the next few years, as they both sat on a Democratic nominating committee for Jackson County, Missouri, they decided who ran for which office.
Sure.
And he was the mob boss of Kansas City. This is like 1949, 1950, maybe 51, somewhere along in there. So, but boy, something happened at about that point in time on into the 60s that they then became outcasts.
You look at a guy like Mo Dalitz, who started out as a bootlegger and became a real big deal in Las Vegas. He was invited to the presidential inaugurations of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And, I interviewed a mob lawyer who's in his 90s now, who knew a lot of these founding people in their later years. And he said to me that guys like Lansky and Costello and Luciano, he said, they were like generals in an army. They could control an entire field of operations. They knew everything that was going on. They were able to delegate responsibility to people who were capable of carrying out what they wanted carried out. He said, you don't have people like that anymore.
Yeah. When Nick Sabella left in Kansas City, and he was like that. He commanded not a big army, but he commanded the entire metro area and places outside. And all he had to do was mention his name, but after him, there was never another guy like that.
And I think that's pretty much happened around the country. I mean, you have a lot of kind of low-level mafia people or young guys who are attracted to that life.
Yeah.
but they don't have the skills or the capability of doing what maybe it was their grandfathers or great grandfathers were able to do.
Yeah, if you think every city, Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, and in every city, even Chicago, they don't have any kind of a charismatic boss anymore. They just kind of have devolved into some crews, is what they have.
Yeah, yeah. When I was working on the Las Vegas gangster book, I went through a history of the leaders of the outfit in Chicago, and over the years, what happened. I mean, at some level, it became a joke almost. There was a guy. He was even Joey the Clown Lombardo.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't imagine this guy, leading an army any place.
Really, yeah. And when it looked like Iupa was going to die, he was kind of the last up front boss. Chicago had a different deal. They had Accardo always and Paul Rica behind the scenes. And then they put Sam Giancana out front as the boss. And then after that, Joey Iupa was the guy that was like the known boss. But you had these guys back behind the scenes. And I think really they had to get their permission, their nod in major things and over the years. And then after Iupa left, Accardo died, Rica died. They were talking about maybe bringing Tony Spilatro back from Las Vegas to be the next boss. There was a serious discussion on that. So go figure.
That would have been a disaster for them.
Yeah.
I don't know if I told you the story. In the 1970s, I was in Chicago. I was promoting a book that I had written. And I had a friend there who owned a small trucking company. And he took me he invited me to a restaurant at a club that he belonged to in the downtown area, which was known as the Loop. And he said to meet him at this club at 6:30. So I got there, and I got there a little early, and he was at the bar talking to somebody. And I went over and I said hello and shook his hand. And he briefly introduced me to this other man. He didn't give me the man's name. He just said to this man, he said, oh, Tony. He said, Jeff, this is Tony. Tony, this is Jeff. We shook hands. And he said, go in the dining room, get a table, wait for me. I'll be in a few minutes. So I waited for him for a few minutes, and he came in and he sat down. And I said, who was that guy you were talking with? He said, oh, his name is Tony Accardo. And I had been having a problem with people pilfering from my trucks. And he told me, that he took care of it and not to worry about it anymore. Yeah. And then he handed me this button that must have been about 5 inches in diameter. It was a big button with Tony's photograph on it. And it said, "Happy birthday, Big Tuna." Under it. And he said to me, wear this button when you go shopping tomorrow. And he said, no one will bother you. He said, you can jaywalk, you can do anything, no one will bother you at all. And I had no idea who this guy was until I got back to New York and I looked him up and I realized he was head of the outfit.
Interesting. I wonder if there's any of those buttons left around today. That would be the ultimate piece
I was looking for it.
You couldn't find it. That would be a great piece of mob memorabilia.
I know when I started writing the mob book about Las Vegas, because so much of it was controlled by the outfit, I went looking for it in all my old drawers and I couldn't find it. I'm so disappointed.
Really? All right. Jeffrey Sussman, this has been great. The book is Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. It's coming out in paperback right now, guys. So get out and grab a copy of that. That can be your go-to book, particularly for New York.
Right.
And I certainly use stuff out of it myself. And it's going to be factual. I know Jeffrey, I've interviewed him several times and know his work well. And so you need to get that book, guys.
Thank you very much, Gary.
All right, Jeffrey. Well, don't forget, look out for motorcycles when you're out there on the road, guys. And if you have any problems with PTSD and you're a vet, go to the VA website. They've got a hotline number there. And I appreciate it, guys. Appreciate it, guys.